Hi everyone, I'm back with another video for Diablo 4 Season 3. So last night we had the announcement and this blog post here. I already made a little summary video, but I want to dive deeper into what we can actually do with those Seneschal companions. Those new mechanical friends that we're going to get as part of the season theme and these different abilities that they have. So there are these governing stones. They are basically these main abilities that they can use. You can choose 2 out of, I think, 12. And there are the tuning stones that are effectively support gems from PoE for these abilities. And there's 27 of them. So you can do a lot of different combinations, and the interface for that looks like this. So you can socket them in there, and you see here there's like one skill slot, there's the other, and then you have 3 of those tuning stones. And you can also unlock more and more of them. You can rank them up, so they're gonna increase in power. Now we don't have any exact details on how strong they are, what kind of damage they deal, or how much of a certain effect you're gonna get. So this is something that remains to be found out later. But I did take some time last night to try to find out what are the potential combos and what could be useful for certain builds. So I went through all of those different tuning stones and the ability stones, and I just tried to figure out, what would we actually consider like a decent combo, for example. What you need to know is for the governing stones, most of these are just kind of like normal attack skills, it seems to me. So for example, there's this gyrate, which is kind of like a whirlwind attack. There's the impale, which is like a line attack. Then there is like slash, that is like a cleave in front. So there are a lot of attacks like this, but there's also these defensive skills, like the auto defense that gives you the ability to shoot down projectiles. There is Reconstruct that heals you. There's Protect that gives you a barrier. So there are also some of those abilities here. And you can use the pet either more defensively like this, or you can give it maybe even 2 separate attacks and have them linked to different utility effects or even damage effects. So right now it remains unclear how strong are these pets actually going to be in terms of damage output. However, it looks like they might be pretty good here. So this is a tweet that I found from Sean White, one of the class designers here at Diablo 4. And he wrote that the companion will scale 1-to-1 with your own stats, your attack rating, crit, everything. So I asked this follow-up question here to see what's about the aspects and uniques and all that, if all of the things transfer. But what it does mean is that there's a pretty high chance that at least some builds can really profit from those pets actually doing a lot of damage. Because compared to, for example, how the skeletons work or how the companions work, I think even for the druids, they don't really seem to scale with everything that you actually do. And if those Seneschal companions do, then this can get really crazy. I believe especially for barbs. We have seen some of those clips with barbs reaching millions of sheet damage or so. That was a Tears of Blood glyph, okay. But even so, you can reach hundreds of thousands of attack power, for example, on barbs, because they have a lot of universal damage buffs, like damage while berserking, all the stuff that actually goes into your attack power rating in the game. Whereas a lot of other classes don't have that, and they rely on other effects that don't directly scale up your character's like sheet damage. So it might be interesting to see how much the Seneschal companions actually differ between the classes. But it looks like there are definitely some potential opportunities here to make a DPS pet that actually kills stuff. So we'll see. But for the most part, there are a lot of these secondary and utility effects that I think are going to be much more relevant and kind of give us back the power that we're going to lose from the vampire powers dropping out. So for example, there is the efficiency support that says when the supporting skills deal damage, you gain critical strike chance to the same target hit. So it's going to be a debuff, and maybe you're going to have plus 5% or plus 10% extra chance to crit. So that increases your DPS and potentially offers up some other synergies with crits. So there's stuff like that. And for example, there's also stuff like resource support. So it says the player gains an amount of primary resource when the supporting skill first deals damage. So you can just have one of these pets attacking really fast, and you can constantly get resources that way. Kind of replacing this Metamorphosis Tibor's Will combo that a lot of people used in Season 2, for example. So there are some of those opportunities. So, and I tried to figure out what would we do. So I went through this here. First of all, I tried to make a little list, figuring out which of the different colors are like these different tuning stones, but this is kind of like just guesswork, so here I'm not going to go much into that. But what is going to be relevant here is this. So there are some of those tuning stones that just have a pretty clear synergy with certain builds. So I want to give you maybe a bit of an idea of, you know, what to get started with when the season comes out, perhaps. Now, there may certainly be a lot more possible combos than what I just wrote down here. This is just like, you know, from the first impressions and going through the list and looking at, you know, all the different builds that actually exist right now in the game. But let's start. So first one is resource. So depending on how much resource you get, this can get really crazy, I guess. And some builds are definitely quite resource hungry in Diablo 4. So some examples that came to my mind are Ball Lightning, Hoda, Double Swing, Polarize, I think Lightning Storm, but maybe once you're a werewolf, not so much. But then Blood Surge, I think Boulder as well, and Sever. So those are some of the builds that came to my mind that already exist that could definitely benefit a lot from extra resources. Of course, everyone can benefit from resources, but you know, rogues, for example, often use combo points. They don't really care, and these kind of things. And so I figured this might be like the list here of builds that would profit plus minus the most. So that obviously depends to be seen like how good that resource effect is, but this is one of those. Then we have the Frigid. So Frigid is a support that gives you a cold dot on a target when the pet hits, and also chills. So that's pretty strong for rogues because they have already Frigid Finesse, which is one of the like passives that gives you extra damage for attacking chilled enemies or frozen enemies. It's a very strong passive. There's also the Noxious Ice aspect. This is the one where you deal extra poison damage to frozen enemies, so you can potentially like freeze enemies faster. For example, together with Penitent Greaves plus the pet, you can maybe freeze stuff in like 2-3 seconds or so. Who knows how fast it is? But if that works, you can potentially dish out pretty crazy poison damage like this. Then there's also the synergy on Necro with the Terror passive. This is the passive for darkness skills that gives you increased damage for slowed and chilled enemies and stunned enemies. Sorgs also have a bunch of passives. There are like some of the cold passives where you deal extra damage against chilled enemies. For example, there's also like damage reduction from chilled enemies in the Paragons. There are some things like that. And I think pretty much every class has the control glyph where you deal extra damage to slowed or chilled enemies. So this is basically what we got here for the cold damage over time support, like this Frigid support is this one. And there's a few more of those kind of supports that give you a certain like damage type as a dot and a certain effect. So similar here for burning. So burning enemies take extra crit damage from the Seneschal construct. Electrocution versus lightning. So it has a dot as well, or like a extra damage part, and then it gives you a chance to stun. Bleeding increases the bleeding damage taken. Poison, yeah. So there's basically these kind of effects here. So the next one here is the poison, which I think is also going to be pretty strong for some classes, including the rogue. Rogue has some natural poison synergy. There is poison immunity, etc., and there are some of those passives. And all of these poison passives are pretty strong. So you can get damage reduction, you can get extra attack speed. There is potentially also some aspects where the target needs to be poisoned and then it can trigger certain things like the Toxic Alchemist. However, I don't trust that one very much. But I think even more important than for the rogues is going to be for the druids. Because now every druid build can have the poison effects from Heightened Malice. This is the Paragon node that gives you extra 45% multiplicative damage if there's 3 or more poisoned enemies nearby. So usually you only really poison with like, Shred or maybe like a Tornado, like a Warnado build or something. And here and there you might have like a Poison Creeper, like Trample Slide. But for the most part, a lot of druid builds just don't really have a good opportunity to use this or have to give up, like the Poison Creeper skill slot in order to actually get any kind of poison up on a target. And if the pet can do that consistently, and to get Heightened Malice, and that is a really powerful effect. And I think pretty much every druid build wants to run that. Then we have Dusk. This is the shadow damage over time effect. So that's going to be mostly important for the Necros, I think, where you have stuff like Reaper's Pursuit. This is the movement speed passive. So you don't really need to rely on, for example, Blighted Corpse Explosion to apply shadow damage over time and get the Reaper's Pursuit, or the shadow damage over time reduction. So you can actually stack, for example, shadow damage over time reduction because the enemies will be affected by it at all times without you having to spam Corpse Explosion, for example. In fact, I think it's going to be quite interesting to see if people are going to try to build chest pieces or pants or something that have multiple of these conditional damage reduction effects, like damage reduction from shadow damage over time, damage reduction from burning, damage reduction from poison. You can actually take an item and put it on another class and then enchant at your occultist and make some potentially really funny stuff in this next season here, because basically everyone has access to all of these conditional effects on all these kind of dots effects, and we can see some really funny items there, I think. Then we have the slow. There's some synergy as well on the Necros. So this is again the Terror passive. We have rogues, slow damage reduction from the Paragons on the cheap shot board. This is something that I put into pretty much every single rogue build anyway, but some rogue builds have definitely some trouble proccing that slow. There's not many good sources of slow on the rogue. There's like a little bit of puncture, and then there's penetrating shots, and there's like dash, and that's almost about it basically. And all of these are somewhat clunky or not even used in some builds. And of course there's the control glyph. So the slow can be really useful for some classes. Then there's the gripping. So gripping is like the pull effect. So it says that sometimes the pet will pull depending on the attack speed or the cooldown, I think, or something. Or here it can only occur every so often. So there is like a certain cooldown, I guess, attached to it. But basically you want to use some kind of like ranged ability most likely, and then have it like, you know, hit as many targets as possible and grip them all in. And I was just thinking like which builds would benefit from that. You know, small AoE, mostly melee builds, for example, Hoda, double swing, twisting blades, arc lash, ball lightning, yeah, flurry, sever, rend, and also I think frozen orb could really benefit from this. So frozen orb, you know, you want to stack up enemies in the explosion, and if your pet is like, for example, charging ahead, putting everything together, and then it just like keeps the enemies there, I think that could be pretty strong. You can also combine this, for example, with the taunt. There's also a taunt on the pet. So you can, like, you know, make it grip enemies and then taunt or something. So that will be quite interesting to see. Then we have mockery. That is actually a taunt here. So I just mentioned that. It can also maybe be used as a stagger mechanic, because taunting is relatively strong, and it just gives you like an extra stagger mechanic if that is like your goal for certain builds, you know, like Sorg builds, for example. You might rely on stagger, or rogue builds with frigid finesse and some other, like, you know, CC multipliers, depending on what kind of boss fights we're gonna get. If the new boss is like super hard, or maybe they're gonna like mega buff Lilith again, or who knows. So stagger might become relevant. And I'm not sure about this, but it's just a thought I had, which is the shared misery taunt. So maybe you can let the pet taunt something, and then you can hit it with shared misery aspect, spreading that taunt so that everything just kind of attacks the pet. We'll see, but it might be a combo. Then there's the Fortify. Fortify is really good for especially rogues, I would say, because they don't have any access to it. So this might just be free 10% damage reduction, basically. Technically, Sorgs also don't have Fortify, but every Sorg runs barriers pretty much, and the barrier does not benefit from this Fortify damage reduction. So there's not really a reason to use this on a Sorg, but it can also be used on other classes. Like, not every Necro build has an easy time stacking up Fortify, for example. Not every Druid build might have that, etc. And for example, for the Barbs, you often use like the Warbringer Paragon node that gives you Fortify when you spend resources. But stuff like Walking Arsenal Barb doesn't spend all that much resources, for example, and actually runs with an aspect instead. And you might be able to replace some of those and get maybe more Paragon points or an extra aspect, or maybe some passive points, even on a Barb. So I think this is generally a relatively powerful effect here that a lot of classes and a lot of builds that want to use here as a supporting option. We have the bleeding here. So I talked about the damage reduction. This is mostly it. Mostly a Barb thing, I guess. I don't really see any other synergies for bleed, but that can be really useful there, again, with the damage reduction, and also some Paragon nodes. There are some synergies there for bleeding. We have the breaking support that gives you vulnerable procs. It doesn't really seem very consistent, so we have that here. Yeah, it says damage from supporting skill instantly destroys enemy barrier effects, which I find pretty strong, actually. I'm gonna go into that in a second. But then there's also the vulnerable here. So it says there's a chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. That chance might be really good, and perhaps when it's like fully ranked up, you have actually relatively consistent vulnerable uptime, maybe even permanent, if you have like a fast attacking skill, for example. But that remains to be seen. But potentially, I think mostly some Barb builds will benefit from the extra vulnerable uptime. There's the Paragon node where they have like some vulnerable plus overpower synergies, for example. And generally, barbs don't really have great vulnerable uptime outside of Exploit Glyph and maybe some stuff like Death Blow and Steel Grasp. So this can definitely help them. Fire Swords in general also going to have a bit of trouble here with the like vulnerable uptime usually, outside of like maybe using Frost Nova. Blood and Darkness Necros, kind of same story. Bone, it's kind of easy, like if you play Bone Spear, for example, you have permanent vulnerable, and there are other triggers as well, but not that much. And also Druids, they don't really necessarily have that much like uptime here. Next up is the Electrocution. This is the lightning damage over time effect. So this can be useful because it also stuns. So it has a chance to stun enemies when they take damage from this. Again, we have the Necro of the Terror. We have Barb with some stun synergies. There's like the Valor passive that's pretty powerful. Double Swing, like every double swing wants to stun as much as possible. So I think in general, if they don't nerf Double Swing, I think Double Swing is going to be a really strong build anyway. And we have the Skullbreakers aspect as well. So there are some synergies. Maybe we're going to see some things with the stun. There's also, again, Control Glyph, for example. There's, again, like Shared Misery that you can use to, like, spread that stun to other enemies. So if you have a lot of lucky hit, then you might be able to just use your pet to stun pretty much the entire pull really easily. So we'll see. But I think this might be one of the top choices here as well. Because also compared to some of these other, like, slow and chill and stuff, stun just completely disables enemies, making it much safer to fight. Then you have efficiency support. This gives you the extra crit chance. So I think the main crit synergies here are on the rogues, especially poison rogues, where you have like, extra poison scaling when you crit. There's lightning swords as well. They usually want to stack up a lot of crit for all the extra effects from chain lightning and lightning spear. Like they all have like certain extra effects when you crit, for example. And the druids as well, like pack leader to reset your companions. And Lightning Storm has a bunch of aspects, for example, that scale of crit. I mean, generally, more crits is more damage, so that's already useful, but I was looking for the extra synergies here. And there might be a few more things that might be relevant. And finally, we have the Burning Tuning Stone that is just going to be really good for basically anything on Sorc. Most Sorc builds run something like Firebolt enchant, or some other like Firewall, for example, just as like a build that actually burns. But basically every Sorc build burns enemies because of Devouring Blaze, because of some of the burning synergies on a Paragon with damage reduction. Like burn is really important on a Sorc, and just having a pet apply burn basically frees up an entire enchant slot for you if this is consistent enough. So if you can make your Seneschal companion actually hit most targets reliably, that's going to be very powerful for Sorcs, I think. Then we have like some other like maybe interesting stuff or maybe crazy stuff depending on how everything works. So for example, there's this protect skill that gives you a barrier, and you can even combine this, for example, with conceded aspect. So if you play a class that, like it's called rogue or barb, I guess, that has a lot of offensive aspects, and sometimes you just don't really find more aspects to put in your build that are really important, but you could get conceded aspect for extra damage. You could potentially get stuff like Lucky Hit while you have a barrier, especially for like Sorcs and Necros. This might be really relevant here if that barrier is consistently up. So we'll see. There might also be stuff like the pet can proc Lucky Hit, especially here with them saying that it scales 1-to-1 with your own stats. It might have a certain Lucky Hit value for all of its skills, potentially proccing all of your effects. And maybe you can do stuff like like extra attack speed and extra multiple projectiles. There's like some support like that, and just like actually produce a lot of hits on a target and trigger all of your effects. So one thing that comes to mind is like Mandel, but there's a lot of other lucky hit effects that you can want to trigger. It's just an example here. Likewise, we have the X-Files ring. So X-Files has turned out to be really powerful in Season 2 for a bunch of builds that can trigger a lot of dot effects with high lucky hit chances. So especially I think Necros were using that and Rogue builds were using that. Also like some stuff on Sorc, like Charged Bolts, for example. So there are a bunch of like X-Files builds everywhere. And if the pet can actually apply like 5 different dots, then that could get really wild. And you're gonna get like a fire explosion, a lightning explosion, a cold explosion, like everything is gonna go like fireworks. It might be pretty crazy actually. Then we also have potential for the Tarasha ring to be pretty broken here. People were already using that in Season 2 with the vampire powers, with infection being poison damage. and you would get a 4th stack on the Tarasha ring on the sword. And right now, maybe this pet might even count as your own damage for the Tarasha ring, and you can get like, 5 stacks or something, and you get like 75% damage multi, or, something like that. It can get really crazy if that works. And also there's this registered damage support. This is a pretty interesting one. So it says that any damage caused from the supporting skill is registered. Registered damage explodes at effectiveness when the target dies as fire damage. So this sounds like the pet actually has to deal some damage to the target to register, but apparently we can scale those pets. So this might mean that maybe if there's an AoE fight, you can actually have, one of your abilities that just like hits a target, and then maybe has like high single target damage, but also the registered damage support. And then as soon as this target dies, the entire pack explodes or something like that. So this could get really crazy as well. Depending on how much you can scale that and how much you can scale the pet in general, I think this might be a really powerful effect here. And also, some stuff that I talked about for like the single target abilities. So we have the lightning bolt plus multi-shot and seeking. So multi-shot is extra projectiles. Lightning bolt seems like this will work with the projectile stuff. And seeking is also an interesting support where projectile skills like basically heat seek enemies. So especially if you have like a single boss and you have like, let's say 5 projectiles, and then they all seek the enemy, so they all actually go in and hit that one boss, you could potentially make some pretty crazy like boss killer like setup here for the Seneschal companion. There's also some tuning stones that I think are going to be always good and always can be like thrown into like pretty much any build, which is going to be Safeguard and Initiative. So Safeguard is also up here. So that's basically just damage reduction. And even if there's a relatively small value, I think the extra damage reduction can always be helpful. It might allow you to drop a defensive aspect for an offensive one or something like that. Or just, make it easier to play through the vault or for the high nightmare dungeons. And together with the Fortify support, these can actually give you like a lot of extra damage reduction. And then we had the Initiative here. This is where it teleports to a target. So this could also be useful for just like any kind of those melee abilities that the pet might have, just to like very rapidly go from enemy to enemy or from pack to pack to apply all of your debuffs instantly. So it like jumps in as soon as it aggroes, I guess, and it teleports in. So I think this could be really important as well to have on a bunch of these effects, just to increase the consistency of the uptime of all of your abilities. So this is what I got for now. So we'll see exactly how things will work. Of course, there is going to be more combos. We're going to discover stuff. We don't have numbers, as I said. But I just try to figure out, what we could potentially do, because we don't know if you're actually going to get any of those numbers before the game launches or like the season launches. So we'll see. And we probably have to figure out a lot of stuff as we go. But at least here we have something to get started with. Personally, I'm quite excited to see how all of those different abilities are actually going to work in practice. Now, I'm not really the biggest like minion enthusiast. I don't really play minion builds like ever really in ARPGs. But I think the Seneschal companion is definitely interesting enough with those different tuning stones, with those different abilities, and there might be some really crazy combos. As I mentioned, there could be like some of those DPS Seneschal companions that actually help you out, maybe filling a niche that your build doesn't really have. Let's say you play Polarized Druid and you make like a really powerful like single target companion, or you play something that has good single target, like let's say Rapid Fire, and then you use like this companion to actually deal AoE damage. So there could definitely be some cool combos here. Trying out all those different skills and those different combinations of supporting abilities could be really fun. This is what I got for now. So we'll see. Maybe there's going to be more info in the campfire. Maybe they're going to show some of the stuff in action and some tooltips and some screenshots and stuff. For now, we don't really have much to go by besides this here, basically. But it's going to be cool, I think. And also there's like 2 more of those tuning stones here, Genesis and Evernight, that we don't know anything about. So this is not part of the preview, and they might be like really crazy or something like that. So we have that down here, and maybe they're gonna have some season special effects that are super wild and everyone wants them or something. So we'll see. Hope you enjoyed this video here. Hope this gets you started on your own theory crafting. Stay tuned for the updated guides. We're gonna be working on all of the Maxwell guides yet again, of course, and have them ready for you before the season starts. And see you guys next time.